Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our program today. We are very excited to share this presentation with you. To start, we're going to open our program with a moment of silence in memory of the victims that lost their lives to the horrific violence in Atlanta. We can't reflect on Asian and Asian American history at NC State without acknowledging the rising violence and prejudice against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities all around the United States. We stand in solidarity with members of the AAPI community in condemning acts of discrimination and violence. Our moment of silence will begin now. Thank you for sharing in that moment of silence.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Sellers, and I am the Assistant Director for Regional Engagement with NC State's Alumni Association. I want to thank you all for joining us today and taking part in one of our next to last programs for this semester's Campus History series, partnering with the libraries. I want to take a moment to thank all of our NC State Alumni Association members for your time and support. We wouldn't be able to do programs like these without your membership. And I'm going to hand it on over to Allison.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Hughes, and I am part of the Program Planning and Outreach team at NC State University Libraries. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's event that we're holding in partnership with the Multicultural Student Affairs and the Alumni Association. The libraries and its partners are working to ensure that our programs are welcoming and affirming for everyone involved. That means that everyone, from event organizers to attendees, has an important role to play in contributing to a respectful and positive environment. That's why we ask you to reflect on the way you pose comments and questions in the chat to ensure that they do no harm to other participants. When we speak, the impact of our words is just as important as our intent. Today, we ask that you engage in this program with exploration and curiosity while being kind and intentional with your words for the sake of our community. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please place your questions in the chat and we will ask the presenter. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to invite Dr. Frank Abrams from the Friends of the Library to provide our welcome. Hey, Frank, you're on mute.
It's a great power you have to mute an old professor. On behalf of Friends of the Libraries and its board, on which I'm privileged to serve, I want to welcome you to Asian and Asian American History at NC State. This is our third program in this semester's Campus History series. This series is among the many stimulating programs provided by the libraries and strongly supported by the Friends of the Libraries. Thank you for engaging in this program. If you're not already a member of the Friends, I hope you will consider joining. In addition to supporting and enjoying a variety of libraries, events, and programs throughout the year, the Friends work to raise funds, and these funds help to enhance the library's crucial role in the success of NC State students. To learn more about our philanthropic organization, please use the link that is shared in the chat. And I really hope you enjoy today's program. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Frank. I am pleased to introduce our presenter to this program, Victor Betts. Victor Betts holds a Master of Library and Information Science degree from San Jose State University with a focus in archival studies and preservation. He is currently a Libraries Fellow at North Carolina State University Libraries, where he works in the Special Collections Research Center. Prior to working at NC State University Libraries, he worked as a library specialist at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Victor also worked in both academic affairs and student affairs at both the University of California System and California State University System with first generation and historically underrepresented communities. I will be dropping a list of reading recommendations focused on Asian and American history and narratives in the chat for everyone to explore after the presentation. Thank you. And Victor, the virtual floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to turn the video off to preserve bandwidth so I can focus on the presentation so you all can see the pictures and stuff very clearly, okay? And I'll go ahead and turn my camera on back during the Q&A. So hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Victor Betts, and I'm Libraries Fellow in the Special Collections Research Center at NC State University Libraries. And I first would like to thank Marion from the Libraries Program Planning and Outreach team for inviting me to be a part of the campus history series, along with Allison, Brooke, and Courtney for handling the logistics for today's talk. I'm also very happy to give this presentation in part to celebrate the annual Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month, or AAPI Heritage Month, here on campus, which is planned by Asian American student leaders and the Multicultural Student Affairs Office. This year's theme is Perseverance, Tales Through Art, inspired by students creating art in the face of adversity. This federally recognized celebration takes place in the month of May, but NC State celebrates it from mid-March to mid-April. So take a look at the schedule of events on the MSA website. I'd like to also thank Virginia Ferris and Todd Kosmerick from Special Collections for supporting my work on this important part of NC State history. And finally, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the recent resurgence of hate crimes and violence against the Asian and Asian American community all throughout the US since the beginning of the pandemic to the most recent murders in Atlanta of 6 Asian women. My hope is to continue to amplify the voices from communities of color and to raise people's awareness about the history of racial and political discourse in the US, including anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. As Afro-Caribbean writer M. Jackie Alexander wrote, we need to become fluent in each other's histories, and I would add stories as well. So with that, let's dive in. So today I'll be introducing you to Asian and Asian American history at NC State University. One of my interests within archival studies and research is the intervening spaces of recorded history where we might find missing or incomplete information as it relates to historically marginalized and underserved communities. When most people think about the dominant narratives of NC State University, Asian and Asian American voices tend to be missing or forgotten altogether, even though we know they are present. However, upon closer look, as I came to find out when I first arrived on campus, a long and ongoing history of the Asian and Asian American experience here on campus and the American South has existed. So I'll be discussing many things today, but I want to make sure you leave today's presentation with the following takeaways. The first is to introduce you to the history of Asians and Asian Americans at NC State. So this will not be a deep dive into the particular history, nor will it be comprehensive, right? So I highly encourage you to explore our resources to learn more. Next, I want to highlight the achievements and contributions of Asian and Asian American community members at NC State. And I'll do that through the individuals who I will be profiling in today's presentation. Next is to have the audience critically think about invisible or forgotten histories and voices, and also sort of thinking and contextualizing larger historical events and its connections to perceptions and treatment of Asian people in the US and abroad. And lastly, is to provide everyone with resources to further research and explore this topic. And I'll show you where you can get started by taking a look at the historical state timeline towards the end of the presentation. So now let's meet some of the earlier Asian students that attended NC State University. And just a quick note, I'd like to acknowledge the lack of gender and ethnic representation in the examples for this particular presentation. There are various reasons why that is, and as many of you may already guess, but I strive to make sure to be inclusive and intersectional throughout the work on this project. And so I selected these 4 students from the digital archives after searching through various university records. And the people you see on the screen now are Taesaku, Pao King, Shankar, and Ernesto. So our first student up is Taesaku Sugishita. He was from Kokufu, or present-day Takayama City, in Japan. He graduated in 1898 with a degree in civil engineering. And what makes Taesaku unique is that he is the first Asian undergraduate student at North Carolina College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, as some of you may already know, is the original name of NC State. And through various records, we know the following about Taesaku. From 1897 to 1898, he participated in the military science and tactics. And of course, during this time period, military science and tactics was part of the required curriculum for all the students. And all the students, of course, were men, of course. And he was part of the cadet officers and held the title of First Lieutenant and Quartermaster. We also know that Taesaku participated in the Russo-Japanese War, which occurred from 1904 to 1905. And then through records from the NC State Alumni Association, they fear or assume that Sugishita had died during the Great Kanto earthquake in Japan, which occurred in 1923. And this was a historically devastating earthquake and fire that led to lots of deaths and tragedy during this time period. Okay. So here are some images of what campus looked like during the late 19th and early 20th century to give you a snapshot visual. The image on the left is Holiday Hall, which was originally called the main building, and the image on the right are campus dormitories. The picture on the left was taken in 1902. And on the picture on the right, you can see a row of dormitories. What's interesting is the building on the farthest from us, I guess it would be the 4th one, is Watauga Hall, which is still present on campus today. Here's images of people on campus during this time period to give you more of a visual context. The image on the left is the first freshman class at North Carolina College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts in 1889. And the image on the right is a group shot with President Alexander Q. Holiday with the first graduating class. And quick factoid, of the 72 students who enrolled as freshmen in 1889, only 19 graduated in 1893. So the next student we have is Pao King Chu, and he was from Shanghai, China. He graduated in 1922 with a degree in textile manufacturing. What makes Pao King unique is that he is one of 4 first Chinese graduates from North Carolina State College of Agriculture and Engineering. The picture you see on the right is a page from the 1922 Agromech yearbook. And here's what the student editors had to say about Pao King, who they nicknamed PK. And they said, quote, "PK has the distinction among the Chinese students of being a polished gentleman with the brightest mind as well as the soundest body," end quote. He also said that we know that the content industry in China will in the near future occupy a more important place in the world under his guidance and leadership, end quote. And just a quick note too, during this time period, and also with same with Teisaku, this was a period where a lot of developing countries were going through industrialization and modernization of their countries. So what they did is they would send their brightest young male students to the West, in the U.S. or in England, to get educated and then bring back the knowledge and skills to help advance and build and modernize their home countries. Our next student is Shankar Krishna Marathe, who was from Pune, or present-day Pune, India. He graduated in 1925 with a major in textile chemistry and dyeing. As you all can see, all these students so far are majoring in, engineering, agriculture, all the things that NC State is known for and has strengthened. And what makes Shankar special, he is one of two first Indian graduates from NC State. And this picture you see on the right is a page from the 1925 Agrimek yearbook. And this is what the student editors have to say about Shankar, whose nickname was Oscar. And I don't know where the Oscar comes from, but here's what they said. They said, quote, "Oscar is the finest subject of the British Empire we have ever seen who did not brag about old England," end quote. And they also said that he won quite a name as an orator on the floors of the House of Student Government. In one of his flowery flights of speech, he broke the House down by vigorous protests against the malicious use by freshmen of his pet name, Oscar, end quote. So these are really positive and glowing statements that they said about Oscar, but they also said some, probably back then, they probably didn't think it was problematic or an issue or what we might consider racist language today. But they also said that Shankar was from the land of Bengal tiger, quote, and that they described him as being a rosy-cheeked snake charmer. So just wanted to share that with you to kind of illustrate some of the perceptions of what the students had of Shankar. Next is Ernesto Ventura Santos. He was from Pasay, Philippines. And he majored in textile chemistry and dyeing and graduated in 1940. He was also part of the Tompkins Textile Society. And what's cool about Ernesto is that prior to coming to NC State, he already had a degree from the University of Philippines, Manila. So, he's really, really highly educated even before he even came here. And the image you see here on your screen is the textile graduating class in front of Nelson Hall in 1940. So next, we'll take a look at some of the Asian and Asian American faculty members who contributed to NC State and beyond. And they are Professor George Matsumoto, Dr. Kenichi Kojima, and Dr. Paul Zia. So George Matsumoto was a Japanese-American architect and educator who is most known for his award-winning modernist designs. In 1948, Matsumoto became a faculty member at the School of Design, which of course later became the College of Design at North Carolina State College of Agriculture and Engineering. During his tenure at the School of Design, Matsumoto won more than 30 awards for his residential work, and his achievements in design were widely published. We have two collections and special collections pertaining to Matsumoto, which are the George Matsumoto architectural drawings and other papers, as well as the oral history interviews with George Matsumoto. The George Matsumoto papers includes blueprints, specifications, sketches, correspondence, publications, scrapbooks, photographs, you name it. And they really document the extensive commercial and residential work of George Matsumoto and Associates. Since 2016, the North Carolina Modernist Houses Organization, or NCMH, has an annual Matsumoto Prize in honor of George Matsumoto. And the George Matsumoto Prize is North Carolina's highest honor exclusively for modernist residential architecture. And the images you see on your screen, the first one is the front view of the George Poland House, which is in Durham County. And we don't know when this photo was taken, like anywhere from 1965 to 2005, and that's part of that collection. And the drawing you see, the architectural drawing you see in the bottom is his drawing of the Bellefonte Country Club in Ashland, Kentucky. And I believe this drawing was made in 1958, March 30th to be exact. Next, we have Dr. Kenichi Kojima. And what's special about Dr. Kenichi Kojima, he is the first Japanese doctorate student graduate. And Dr. Kojima graduated in 1958 with a PhD in experimental statistics. Dr. Kojima was also an assistant geneticist with the genetics department, along with a joint appointment with the Department of Experimental Statistics in 1958. He became associate professor of genetics in 1963, then promoted it to full professor in 1964. And if there are any faculty members in the audience here today, I'm especially newly appointed faculty members, assistant professor, you can see that the tenure process was much quicker back in the day than it is today. So that's something that I noticed when I was looking at the record. Another interesting fact about Dr. Kojima was that he was the PI, or principal investigator, for the lab where Justina Williams, who is photographed on your screen there, and Justina Williams was a research assistant and is the first African-American academic staff member at NC State, where she assisted with genetics research with Drosophila, or fruit flies. And in this image, Williams is counting the various mutations which result from crossing the lines of fruit flies. And next we have Dr. Paul Zia, who is a native of China. And he earned his BS in civil engineering from the National Chiao Tung University in China and immigrated into the US in 1949. He became a member of the civil engineering faculty in 1961 and was appointed associate department head of civil engineering in 1967. As Dr. Zia also served as the head of the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at NC State from 79 to 88, and he is recognized as an international authority in the field of reinforced and pre-stressed concrete structures. Dr. Zia is currently a distinguished university professor emeritus of civil engineering, and in 2002, the Paul Zia Distinguished Lecture Series was established in his name as a way to showcase outstanding engineers, their projects, and to honor Zia by recalling his contributions to the knowledge of concrete, his contributions to increasing the stature of NC State, and the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering. And the images you see on the screen is the first one with graduate student Mohammed Talat Mustafa and Dr. Paul Zia making casting segments of concrete cooling tower model that was taken in 1978. The second photo on the right is a research lab photo, and then the record does not indicate who the other person is, but it was taken in 1980. And then the last photo on the bottom is a picture from the engineering award ceremony And then set in the 70s with Dr. Henry B. Smith, who was then Associate Dean of Engineering, along with Dr. Paul Zia and Dr. Larry K. Monteith, who was the Dean of Engineering. So to bring things a little closer to our current time period, here are 3 events from the timeline. Jenny Tang was elected as student body president from 1998 to 1999, becoming the first Asian American woman student body president. And in 2004, the Technician covered a story on Chang's return to campus, where she gave a talk about breast cancer awareness in her own story with stage 4 breast cancer. NC State University offered its very first Asian American Culture and Literature course, specifically FL 394, and that's a special topics class. And it was offered in the spring of 2016. The class was taught by Nathaniel Isaacson from the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures, and he was the assistant professor of modern Chinese literature. And as you can see, he is not Asian American, so his expertise and training on the subject. But this was a common practice at many universities that they don't have formal Asian American studies courses on record or permanent record. That definitely was the case at my prior institution at UC San Diego, where a math faculty was the first to actually teach a course on Asian American history. And the former assistant director of the GLBT Center, Nathan Nguyen, contacted Isaacson to develop this course due to increasing student interest. So again, we can see this course was a reaction to students' demand. And the third event is the Filipino American Student Association, or FASA. So quick shout out to FASA, who officially established as a student organization in 2018, but the students had unofficially formed prior to this fall 2017. So far, I've covered all the fantastic achievements, accomplishments, and milestones by members of the Asian and Asian American community here at NC State. But reality, as we know, is that America was not always hospitable to Asian people, and to some extent, it's right, even today, both in the US and in abroad, particularly if you look at the history of US militarism, imperialism, and occupation, and those effects can still be felt and seen today. So to paint a more fuller picture of the Asian American experience, I want to provide you with some historical context to help situate the state of race and immigration during the late 19th century and early 20th century that impacted immigrants and Asian Americans during this time period and today, right? The following are federal immigration laws that either banned or restricted Asians from traveling and or settling in the United States. So first up, we have the Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women and other East Asian women, but mostly Chinese, from immigrating to the United States. And the second, and following the Page Act, is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was a federal law signed by President Chester Arthur, and it prohibited Chinese immigrant laborers. And this ban is perhaps one of the more notable immigration bans, which present-day researchers and legal scholars recall in relation to today's immigration bans and policies. Then we have the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, which was an informal agreement where the US would not impose restrictions on Japanese immigration, and Japan would not allow further immigration to the US. And then there is the Immigration Act of 1917. This law excluded entry for anyone born in the, quote, Asiatic barred zone, except for immigrants from Japan and the Philippines. It also required literacy tests for immigrants over 16 years of age, and it also increased the tax paid by new immigrants upon arrival. Um, and lastly, there was the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, and that excluded Japanese immigrants to the US as well. So this time period from the late 19th century to early 20th century is where we also see an abundance of political cartoons, advertisements, and propaganda art that further perpetuated stereotypes of Asian people, and along with African Americans, Native Americans, Latin American countries, and countries in the Caribbeans. Um, and it was just another means to sort of rationalize and justify discriminatory legislations and policies that were based on racism, as well as US wars and colonial occupation abroad, right? Because there was definitely, when you look at the historical records and look at the political cartoons, there was this notion when the US sort of like occupied other countries, and the reasoning for justification because they wanted to also educate and civilize quote unquote savages, right? And that's sort of the language and the beliefs that they held during the time. So what you see on this slide are discussion questions I pose to students in my instructions. I've used this timeline with international students when teaching about the history of international students here at NC State. And it's remarkable to see them critically think about their own experiences living in the US to current events, and then going a step further by contextualizing it to historical events that impacted Asian people in this country. Understanding the history, policies, and legacies of exclusion in the US is a great beginning to see how barriers and disenfranchisements exist today. Excuse me. So this next timeline jumps forward to the mid 20th century to present day events, starting with the Executive Order 9066, which was enacted in 1942, that authorized the incarceration of Japanese Americans and Japanese residents under then President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And just a quick note here, people might know this event as internment, Japanese internment. However, the Japanese American Citizens League, founded in 1929, along with the Japanese American community, urges the use of the term incarceration as it more accurately reflects the events that took place of US citizens. Then we have one of the first establishments of Asian American Studies Department in the US, which occurred in 1968 at San Francisco State University. And this was a result of student strikes and protests during this time. Next is the murder of Vincent Chin, which took place in Michigan in 1982, where Vincent Chin, a Chinese American man, was brutally murdered by two white auto industry workers whose anger and hate were fueled by the success of the Japanese auto industry in the US at the time. There's a great documentary titled Who Killed Vincent Chin, if you would like to learn more about this story. Next are the Los Angeles riots, or LA riots, that took place in 1992, which occurred after the acquittal of 4 LAPD officers for the beating and arrest of Rodney King. You know, I could remember watching this footage on TV as a child growing up. And it's also amazing how, if I hadn't told you the date of this event, it sounds very much like something that occurred in 2021, right? And the verdict sparked riots that also stirred underlying racial tensions between the Korean American and African American communities that had been ongoing prior to this incident. And some of you may know that the riots that took place in LA also took place in K-Town or Koreatown, which a lot of the Korean American business owners had their businesses and establishments. And next is COVID-19, which we're very familiar with, which began in 2020. This is where we really saw the resurgence of anti-Asian violence and crimes inflamed by racist rhetoric and xenophobia, which, as I showed you previously, has a long history of existence in the US, right? And so some of the questions you might want to ponder with the information um, um, and to ask yourself is, so, what do you think about these immigration laws, right? And like, how do you think they affected Asian students and faculty attending universities in the US? And also, can you see any connections to the present day views and their treatment of Asian Americans and immigrants in the US? So I've shown you a little of what exists in our collections today, but we want to make sure to capture more diverse and inclusive voices in the archives, such as those of Asian and Asian American community. And here to talk about how we can all do that is my colleague, Virginia Ferris from Special Collections. So I'm going to turn it over to her for a moment.
Thank you, Victor. So as Victor said and has demonstrated, we have some really wonderful, rich collections in the libraries in our Special Collections Research Center that document the history of our university, that document the students and the faculty, the staff, the alumni who have passed through this community and are still part of this community. But we often, in teaching classes, Victor, myself, and our colleagues are confronted with some unfortunate gaps in the record, especially for historically marginalized communities, for the voices of students from those communities in particular. So one way that we've been working to repair those silences in the archives is through oral history, through sitting down with individuals from our community and getting their stories on the record, having their firsthand narratives preserved. And part of that as well is an extension of these oral histories is the Wolf Tales program. This is a project that started about 5 years ago to capture shorter stories of the NC State community that include students, current students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and to provide a space where more voices can be heard and preserved and remembered. This is part of our mission in the libraries and in special collections to value and document and share the voices of our community, the diversity of our community for researchers and students and folks to learn from for many generations. So you can visit the website, the link on Victor's slide here, go.ncsu.edu/wolftales to explore the collection that's available. These recordings are made at different events on campus, at reunions, at student organizations events, at exhibit openings, all kinds of things, where we invite community members to sit down individually or as a group of friends, peer mentors, what have you, to share stories about their experiences at NC State. And it's allowed us to capture more diverse voices of our history as it's happening today and moving forward so that we don't encounter some of the same silences that we find when we try to understand the voices and the stories of the students, the alumni that Victor's highlighted, and some of the faculty. So I invite you to explore the link on the page here, and you're also welcome to contact us if you have questions, if you're interested in learning more. Our email address, library_wolftales@ncsu.edu. And currently with the pandemic, we have had Wolf Tales on pause because it has been an in-person initiative, but Victor, myself, and our colleague Shelley Black are exploring the possibilities of a virtual platform we're going to develop in the future, in the near future, to allow our community to share their stories remotely. So stay tuned for that, and if you're interested, just contact us and we can share more information as that becomes available. So thank you, Victor. I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Virginia. So now I'm actually going to show you all the timeline that we've developed. Really quickly, so let me just go there. But so just to make sure, can you all see that?
We can.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for that confirmation. So this is the Historical State Timelines website through our special collections. And as you can see, we have categorized them through a bunch of different topics and themes, such as African Americans, campus buildings, libraries, enrollment and tuition data, student body presidents. And so my archival research, I developed the Asian and Asian American community. And so we'll go ahead and click on there to get a start. So just quick notes about the timeline. It's chronological. It just goes up and down. It's pretty self-explanatory as the direction it goes. And when you click on the images, it'll actually take you to the image. Now I'll do that in a moment before going there. So quick notes. One of the things I wanted to make sure when I was developing this timeline is to really respecting the cultures and individuals and communities that are in the timeline and in the archives. And one of the ways that I did is, for example, with let's see, the example of Madame Nu, who visited NC State in '63, the use of the diacritical mark, which is used in Vietnamese text, and making sure that those symbols tells the reader how to pronounce certain letters, right? So I just wanted to make sure that I captured that properly there. Another thing I was mindful about is changing racial and ethnic categories as well as place names. So for example, in the record, some, at a certain time period, Bombay could have been, Mumbai would have been referred to as Bombay or vice versa. The changing and evolving names of, for example, like Myanmar and Burma. And also the fact that Taiwan and Hong Kong were still considered China during certain time periods, right? So I'm making sure that I distinguish those countries and recognize different nation states and sovereignties and independence and things like that. There's also, of course, problematic language, especially, before my time period. So my grandparents and prior, it was very common for non-Asian people, Western people, to refer to Asian people as quote unquote Oriental people or Orientals or a bunch of other names. And of course, that is an archaic and outdated term. So you never should call an Asian person Oriental. So those are the things I made sure to sort of look out for. Also, recognizing generational immigration and the national differences as well as their connections. So making sure that I call this timeline the Asian and Asian American community and not just lumping everything into Asian, because of course there are different lived experiences, generational differences of Asian Americans and Asians, and not that they're super different, but then I make sure we acknowledge the different lifestyles there and historical experiences. Let's see, and also I wanted to make sure that I captured today's student voices. So if we go down to the bottom of the timeline, we'll get more recent and some more text. And so last year when I met with the Asian American student leaders, I talked to them, introduced myself, talked to them about my project and research, and some of them were able to participate in providing archival information so I can add to the timeline. For example, FASA here that I mentioned earlier. It's really cool to really capture that. And this project is iterative and it's ongoing, so it never stops. So I'm always looking for, new records and new information to add to the timeline, but also to the archives here in special collections, like for example, the Wolf Tales oral history that Virginia was talking about. And also, really, last but not least, I wanted to highlight the importance of marginalized communities, even within the category of Asian, right? Oftentimes, the broader narrative or dominant narratives of Asian and Asian American stories tends to focus on East Asians, so that's Japanese, Chinese, Korean. But I also wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence to actually search for voices and narratives of Southeast Asian countries, Southeast Asian voices, for example, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and also even ethnic communities within these countries, right? So in particular, the Hmong community, and especially the Hmong community, I think is really interesting for North Carolina because within the US, North Carolina has the 4th largest Hmong population. And I have not been able to find any records pertaining to Hmong individuals and community members in the archives. But my hope is to sort of reach out to Hmong students, and I just haven't heard back yet from Hmong students and faculty members who are connected to the NC State community. So those are the ways I'm really trying to be mindful and intersectional with my archival research here. And let me just go ahead and show you what happens when you go ahead and click on one of the images here in the timeline. So it takes you to this platform, and I'll give you the title of the image. And one of the cool things about this platform, and shout out to our awesome digital team and special collections, and especially our digital archivists. And you can sort of really zoom in on really high quality, high res photo, and then you can really move with your cursor. As you can see, you can really zoom in on Tesaku. And it's just really, really great to have. And when you click on here, more information, it gives you all the extra additional information, or what we call metadata as well too, right? And for example, if you wanted to download the image, you can download the image right here. And you can also, if you're creating a blog or a website, you can also always embed the code and the hyperlink here. But of course, as a librarian, I have to make sure you all always cite properly. So if you come down here, making sure that you click on the rights field to kind of figure out how to properly cite, and making sure that you are not infringing on any copyrights or permission use. And all the information right here on the left is extra metadata. So, you'll see the subjects that pertains to this photo, the original size of the document, the date it's created, and also any information that that's actually on the verso or the actual material itself. I mean, of course, as Virginia mentioned earlier, we don't always have information because there's always gaps and missing information and absences. So we do the best we can to really fill the information as much as we can. And then below, it'll kind of spit you out sort of like other materials that you should explore, which it suggests. So that is the timeline. And I see we're at 12:50, so I'll go ahead and go back to my presentation really quickly and put it on presentation mode. And then open up for Q&A. But while we do that, I just want to point out this AAPI reading recommendations list that I made. It's a small reading list by AAPI writers and scholars. And whenever a violent event occurs towards communities of color, the questions of why something like this happened recirculates the ethos in popular news cycles. But that work and labor of answering such questions and more have been addressed in many different works of literature and scholarship by people of color for generations, right? So I encourage you all to begin learning and unlearning on your road to becoming fluent in the stories and histories of other communities. So I definitely want to thank you very much for being here today, and I hope you continue this conversation beyond this talk with others. And I encourage each of you to visit the Special Collections website to learn more about what we do. And of course, again, our awesome team has provided open access to our entire digital collections so that anyone with internet access can explore some of our rare and unique materials for research. So with that, I'll go ahead and open it to Q&A. While I sip of water.
Thank you so much, Victor. We have some questions ready for you. Sylvia asked if Mr. Sujishita, who graduated in 1898, was also the first international student at NC State.
Yes, that's a very great question. Actually, Tesaku is not the first international student. The first international student is actually a Cuban international student whose name is Jose Fabio Santo Trigo. And he enrolled in NC State in 1892, so a few years prior to Teisaku. Great question.
And then we have another question
Mhm.
about him as well. And Orion would like to know if his enrollment is the first evidence of Asians at NCSU that you found in your research.
Teisaku Sugishita, the first Japanese, first
Yes.
Asian student. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. According to what's in our archives, he is the first Asian student on record that I was able to find.
Sylvia is also wondering if there's any evidence or thoughts on the kind of prejudice these early Asian students might have experienced in a majority white student body.
That's a great question. Yeah, like I mentioned before with Virginia and how there's a lack of record of student voices, right? And even the records that we do have tend to be from the voices of white male students or faculty members or librarians or archivists, right? And so the only piece of information I can glean on, or maybe a researcher can actually glean in on, is like I read that description about how the students were just describing Shankar as being a rosy-cheeked snake charmer, and he's from the land of the Bengal tigers, right? So there definitely is this sense of Orientalism or exotification that's attached to the Asian or the quote-unquote mysterious Orient during this time period, right? And then so in our particular archives, I have not found any records of that, but they definitely do exist elsewhere. So, yeah.
Thank you. Nashia would like to know what the name of the book / documentary that you mentioned during the portion that you mentioned during the Asian American History Continued portion.
Oh, the documentary for the murder of Vincent Chin, I believe. Yeah, it's called "Who Killed Vincent Chin." I believe PBS also did a really great sort of like documentary that sort of looks at the actual film. So check out PBS or what was it? NPR. Yeah, either of those. I'm pretty sure it's PBS. About that, you also can go to YouTube and just type in Vincent Chin or "Who Killed Vincent Chin." There's also another. There's several documentaries. The one's really cool one, probably in the '90s, where there's a film. A person who's going around university campuses asking students, Asian students, like, do you know who Vincent Chin is? And then you can see like all the students have no idea who Vincent Chin is. So it's about the story of how the lack of knowledge or how people are not aware about Vincent Chin. So yeah, thank you for asking that question.
Were there any Asian American or Asian student organizations earlier in NC State's history?
I'm pretty sure there were, especially during the 80s, I would guess, and 90s. But again, if we actually take a look at the Asian enrollment, let me take a look really quickly too. I think it's in the 70s. So let me make sure I get my numbers correct. Okay, so in 1976, out of 16,903 students, there were only 54 enrolled students who identified as Asian. So you can imagine with such small numbers, I mean, I want to say it's less likely maybe in the 70s, not to say that there wasn't, but yeah, I haven't found particular information about student actually, there was a metropolitan club during, I think, 40s or 50s that was a club for international students. So that club did exist, now that I think about it. Yeah.
Nancy asked, has any research been done on Asian refugees within the Wolfpack community?
That's a great question. Not to my awareness. And especially in terms of academic research, since my focus is in the records that exist in our archive. But yeah, that's a great question and a great topic to kind of venture into. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, my interest and focus in marginalized communities, even within the Asian community, for example, Vietnamese or Hmong communities. And so the refugee immigrants, refugee communities in the Asian, within the Asian category tend to be mostly from Southeast Asia. Of course, that corresponds with the US, if you follow the US military and history of US military in Southeast Asia.
During your research, did you come across significant records of South Asians at NC State?
I did, yeah. There were quite a few records of South Asians. And of course, the timeline really just focuses on like firsts and like big, huge accomplishments. Of course, even my timeline doesn't capture everything, but there are, especially like in the 50s, you'll start to see more enrollment of South Asian students. And then of course, the category of South Asian is very broad too. So you have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So we have lots of different representation even within the South Asian category at NC State, for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about any gaps in the history that or in gaps in the archival record that you may have come across and how you dealt with that?
Yeah, so one thing that I'm really was sort of bummed out about, of course, this is all par for the course and archival research, but I really wanted to find more information that pertaining to the Hmong community, only because like I mentioned earlier, that North Carolina has the fourth largest Hmong community in the U.S. So, and I know that most of them reside in eastern North Carolina. But it would make sense that there probably is a community in Raleigh, being the capital. So that definitely is a gap in the records, of course. And as a previous person stated before, gaps in terms of records that are from the actual voices of Asian students and Asian American students is definitely missing. And I wish it existed, but what we're doing now is to try to recoup and prevent that from happening by initiatives such as the Wolf Tales Oral History Program.
We did get a comment that one of our attendees wrote their master's thesis on the Hmong North Carolinians at State and would love to share her research.
Fantastic,
So
yes.
We'll have to connect you guys after this.
Absolutely, please email me.
Yeah, okay, so have a couple more questions coming in. Mm-hmm. Did many of the Asian students return to their own country to pursue their degrees and make their contributions, or was it a trend for the students to remain here?
Yeah, so especially in the earlier student profiles that I did with Shankar and Taesaku and then Pao King, of course, and I also mentioned with Taesaku is that all of them returned back to their country, and and during this period of industrialization and modernization of the home countries, it was sort of common for the students to come to the Western universities, get educated, get skills and expertise, and go back to the country. So they did return. Now I know that there is in downtown. I remember last year when I went to the Downtown Museum of North Carolina History. I believe it was a small one, not the two bigger museums. They have a record of the first Indian immigrant or first immigrant in Raleigh, I believe, in North Carolina. And he, if I remember correctly, he went to NC State and graduated and stayed because he had a girlfriend or a wife and kids. So he might be the first immigrant resident. But Shankar and the other Indian student attended NC State prior to him. So it precedes the first Indian and first immigrant resident of Raleigh.
Great, thank you so much. We are at close. We are at 1 o'clock.
Hey.
So thank you everyone for attending. This was a great program. I'm speaking for myself. I definitely learned a lot about NC State's history and about the people who contribute, or about people who contributed to NC State. So thank you so much, Victor, for presenting this for our community. I'm gonna go ahead and end the program now. So thank you everyone for attending.